All right, it's 12 o'clock and it's Wednesday. That means it's time for the Iowa Learning Farms Conservation Webinar. I'm Matt Helmers with Iowa State University. Happy to be back and helping to moderate the webinar today. And as I said last week, we got another soil scientist here, Dr. Nathan Nelson. Oh, I should say, do you refer to yourself as a soil scientist, Nathan?
I definitely.
Okay. All right. We had Jeff Strock on last week, and so that's why I say that. So we're really fortunate to have Dr. Nathan Nelson, that's a professor in the Department of Agronomy at Kansas State University. And Dr. Nelson has been doing a lot of work on cover crops and has some great research on looking at the impacts on surface runoff, sediment, and phosphorus losses that we'll get to hear today. And as always, if you have questions, please type those into the chat box and we'll get those to Dr. Nelson at the end of his talk. And with that, Nathan, the virtual floor is all yours.
Okay. I mean, thank you very much, Matt. I'm glad to be here and glad to have an opportunity to share our research. And I've got a slide. Oops, let me go to the next slide here. I'm not sure how long you need this slide up here, Matt.
We can, at the end, we can talk about that. So,
okay, this is at the end.
Yep.
Before we get into the research, I appreciate coming here and presenting this research, and I've had the pleasure of kind of coordinating and leading a really great team that has come together to do this work. And we've got a variety of faculty and graduate students and research assistants and undergraduates that have all been helping on this project. And so I want to acknowledge all of their assistance here. I won't go through and read all their names, but they've all contributed in one way or another to some of the data that I'll be sharing here today. Before I get into the data, I'm just going to talk a little bit about some background water quality issues. And I'm sure many of you are maybe familiar with water quality issues. And some of these things change just a little bit as you move from one area of the state to the next, or country, I should say, to the next, where our emphases are. Some of the concerns here in Kansas, our major concerns are sediment and phosphorus in our surface water. We don't have quite the same concerns about nitrates in the surface water because our agricultural practices and our soils and some of the geology and rainfall and so forth just make it so that that's not quite as big of an issue as it is like maybe in Iowa. Our two major water quality issues, we've actually got a few reservoirs here that we've started to dredge. And I think we're not unlike other areas of the country where these are both some major water quality concerns, particularly with the phosphorus concerns. We have an increase in the amount of harmful algal blooms. And these are blue-green algal blooms. And this started back around maybe 10, 12 years ago. Started seeing more of these harmful algal blooms popping up and spread across the state. Over the last, about a 10-year period, we've got over 100 lakes and reservoirs in over half the counties of the state, stretching all the way across. And so a lot of concerns, and you see headlines like these out there where there's a police warning about harmful algal blooms or public advisories, and it's becoming more common that as you talk to people and you talk about different reservoirs, people start recognizing, yeah, well, you may not go to that reservoir quite so much anymore because they tend to always have harmful algal blooms, and that limits, the weekend I want to go out boating and I can't. So it's having some impacts, and it's a concern. And phosphorus plays a role in this. I won't get into the water biology issues here because that's not my area. There are definitely other things that impact these harmful algal blooms. I view it kind of like growing a crop out in the field. We fertilize with phosphorus because we know it's going to help our crop growth. Some years there are other things that limit crop growth. Some years, from one year to the next, there are a variety of things that impact crop growth. That's the same with an algal bloom. Only with the algal bloom, we want to remove the phosphorus. That we would prefer to have the phosphorus limiting crop growth or algal bloom. And so several years ago, we had quite a few people coming to us saying, well, we know that we should be subsurface applying phosphorus fertilizer, that reduces our risk for phosphorus loss in surface runoff and reduces the amount of phosphorus in our surface waters. He said, well, what if we're growing cover crops? If we're growing cover crops, can we do a fall broadcast fertilizer application? And this is advantageous because it's faster, takes less labor, easier to contract out, tends to be less expensive by quite a bit for a producer to do this. And they say, well, can we just save some money on our fertilizer and effort on the fertilizer application and put that into maybe cover crop management? And we didn't have a lot of good data on this. We looked around, we couldn't find good data, and we thought, well, cover crops can definitely reduce erosion, we thought, and they could reduce runoff, and so why not reduce phosphorus loss at the same time? And so we went ahead and put together a large study looking at the effects of cover crops and phosphorus fertilizer management and their effects on sediment loss and phosphorus loss in surface runoff. With some of these main questions here, we wanted to look at if you're using a cover crop, will that affect the right time and placement of fertilizer? Or basically, could we use a cover crop to reduce our phosphorus loss from the spring, from a fall applying, surface applied phosphorus placement? We also wanted to look at how these things affect yield and economics and soil health and soil physical properties. And we've had an opportunity to look at all of that. You can ask me questions about it, but I'm just not going to go into all of that. I think that's like 2 or 3 dissertations worth of data. So I'm not going to hit all that today, but I'll hit the main things with water quality. So just give you an idea of where we're doing this research. We have a facility here we call the Kansas Agricultural Watershed Field Laboratory. You can see it on this hill slope here. These large areas are each of the experimental units, and so we have plots that are about 1.2 acres in size and arranged on this hill slope. Here's a view from an aerial photograph, and you can kind of see that there's a parallel terrace system in this field that's sloping from the top of the slide down to the bottom of the slide. And we went ahead and divided this into 18 experimental units. I said about 1.2 acres in size. And then at each one of these red triangles, that's where the water exits each one of these large plots. And at then each one of those exits, we collect our runoff and so forth. And then the experiment that we set up, we said, well, we want to look at the effects of cover crops definitely and how that interacts with our phosphorus management. And so we had a series of phosphorus treatments, pretty simple here. No phosphorus fertilizer that was fall broadcast, or phosphorus fertilizer that was placed in a 2x2 placement at planting. So we're looking at kind of a few different systems of phosphorus because we're changing the time of application, the placement, and even the fertilizer source. One is diammonium phosphate was broadcast, and the other is ammonium polyphosphate that was placed at planting. But these are common systems that we would see producers using, right? If someone's fall broadcasting, that's the type of fertilizer management that they would use often relative to something that might have been in the spring. Our cover crops, we either just had no cover crop or with a cover crop. And for the first 5 years of this study, our winter cover crop was a mixture of small grains and brassica, where we had like winter wheat and rapeseed or triticale and rapeseed for most of the time. I'll be honest that most often it was just simply the small grain that survived through the winter and provided all of the biomass. I'll present a little bit of data for the next phase of the study, 2020 through to our current time, and where we've continued this study with different phosphorus treatments for the same cover crop, with the exception that our cover crop changed to cereal rye from 2020 until the present. So it's a corn soybean, no-till corn soybean rotation. It just goes back and forth between corn and soybean from one year to the next. And what at the edge of each plot, we collect runoff with automated water samplers, and we measure the runoff for every single event that happens during the year. Most of the data that I'll be kind of talking about today is really a summary of annual average or annual data, so the total losses for a year, rather than going into individual event type data. But that's what we have, and we analyze those samples for sediment, phosphorus, and dissolved reactive phosphorus. A lot of other agronomic, economic, and even some soil health stuff that's not listed there. I won't get into that today. Before we jump into a lot of the data, I want to just kind of talk about some things that are probably more obvious for a producer that's out in the field often, and I think isn't going to be a surprise to anybody, but I think it's not necessarily what we immediately think about when we're looking at data. And so when we're looking at runoff, even though I might present data for a whole year or even by different events, there's a lot of variability that happens during the year based on when rainfall occurs. And so here's precipitation events for like the first, I think 2 years of the study. And you can see that there's obviously wet and dry periods, and you've got groups of rain where sometimes, a lot of rain comes at one time with some big events, or maybe there's a series of a bunch of small events, and then a long period of no events, and then maybe, a few single events, and then more groups. This is not a surprise to anybody, but it's important to recognize that not only at the same time you have this highly variable and somewhat sporadic grouping of precipitation events, these happen on very different conditions out in the field. And so sometimes you might have a very big difference between the cover crop and no cover crop, right? Where you've got this lush cover crop growing, and then maybe another time all the cover crop is dead, but yet a good cover on the soil surface. Then you get into the cropping season, and really most of the vegetative cover looks about the same across the entire field. After harvest, doesn't look like there's a whole lot of difference between cover crop and no cover crop. And then, it cycles again through the year. And you mix this up with different types of precipitation patterns, and you can end up with times where the cover crop has different effects, right? Or the cover crop treatment has a different effect because of different weather conditions and growing conditions and so forth. So why this is important is there's, this is a little different than like a rainfall simulation study or something like that, where we can go out and look at just one event time. We're trying to group all of this into multiple events. If you were to look at it as a single event, particularly this is the effect of cover crops on runoff volume, we find that at sometimes the cover crop reduces runoff volume. And this is what a lot of people expect. This is what we expected in the beginning. We say, well, the cover crop's using water, it's maybe increasing infiltration. So we'll see a decrease in runoff volume. We definitely saw that, and we'll still see that in different events today. But then we saw a series of events also where our cover crop is increasing runoff, right? And so, well, what's going on there? These tended to be periods of the year where we had a lot of rainfall events, maybe right one after another, and where the cover crop maybe wasn't growing very rapidly, either because of maybe really cool conditions that were present out there, or maybe because we'd already killed it for the year. Whatever it was providing cover but not using water, and so our soil surface stayed wet longer. And then when we got more rainfall, we actually got more runoff. And so, some of the data that I'll be showing here in the next few slides are summarizing the annual effects. And if we looked at this over the entire year, we see, and this is actually over the first 3 years, the average runoff per event. Over the first 3 years, we saw absolutely no effect of cover crop, because there were some events that were higher and some events that were lower. But if you look at the average effect, really wasn't doing a whole lot to change the runoff volume. But what it was doing is it was dropping our peak flow. And this is important. So our peak flow, or the amount of water moving at the highest point, that was quite a bit less. The time to infiltration tended to be increased by about, or time to initiation, I should say, not infiltration. Time to initiation was reduced by a little bit. Time to peak was reduced. Don't seem like big differences, but 7 minutes, meaning it's shifting that peak longer. It takes a little bit longer to reach the peak, and then longer even to finish. And so what we're doing is we're stretching out the runoff, happening over a longer period of time, but getting about the same amount. And this tended to be a more consistent result, at least over the first 3 years of the study. We've got a student looking at this, trying to look at it over the lifetime of the study now to see how it might have changed, or if it's changed. But so we see, even though it might, cover crops were not affecting the average runoff for event, there are more consistent effects on the way that runoff exits the field. So here's some data looking at the effects of cover crops on runoff for by year. You see that for the first 3 years of the study, there was no effect. And then in 2018 or 2019, 2020, 2 years where we actually had pretty high rainfall, then we saw, maybe we're starting to see a cover crop effect, followed by 2 years with, again, absolutely no effect of the cover crop on runoff. So this was, like I say, we had initially effectively would reduce runoff. And we did it for a few years, but other years not. This hydrograph here shows an example, I guess a visual example of what I mean by stretching that runoff out and changing the way that it moves. So this is just a single runoff event that I've selected, and these are 2 plots that were right next to each other. And it so happens that if we look at the total amount of water that left these 2 plots, it's almost identical, like very, very close, within a few gallons. But we have very different patterns, where one hit a much higher peak. That peak occurred earlier, and then it stopped running off earlier. The other one, peak occurred later, it's lower, and overall a broader peak, meaning there was more time where we had sustained runoff in the field. Less intense runoff, right? So that less intense runoff is reflected really drastically in the cover crop effects on sediment loss. And I'll have to say that initially, even though there's a lot of data that showed that cover crops reduce erosion, we were in a no-till system. There wasn't as much data in no-till systems. I think there's a little bit more now. But and we thought, well, we're doing really well with our no-till. A lot of producers in this area do no-till farming, and we see big reductions in sediment loss with no-till. And so we thought, well, can you really get much better than that? And sure enough, we could. And so this is great, 60 to 70% reduction in erosion, extremely consistent every year of the study. You can see it visually when you go out to collect samples. Here's some runoff. You can see it visually in the runoff that the runoff and the cover crop plots have much less sediment. And this happens regardless of the time of the year. The cover crop, and even years where we have really poor cover crops, not a lot of cover crop growth, whatever, we still see a big reduction in sediment. So really, really consistent results. This is great. Generally, we would expect a reduction in phosphorus loss along with that reduction in sediment, because sediment transports a lot of phosphorus. Even though we're seeing very consistent reductions in sediment, we did not see those consistent reductions in phosphorus loss. In fact, some years, 2018, 2022, we saw increases in total phosphorus loss with the cover crop. And we got 2 years, 2019, 2020, it's where we saw a reduction in total phosphorus loss with the cover crop. Those are also 2 years where we saw a reduction in runoff with the cover crop. I think those two are going to go a little bit hand in hand, that we see both of them together. And then several years where we see no effect. And so then that brings up the question, well, why aren't we seeing this a more consistent reduction in total phosphorus, and even sometimes an increase in total phosphorus loss with the cover crop? And that comes back to the form of phosphorus that's lost in this cover crop system. So here we see a pretty consistent effect with an increase in the amount of dissolved reactive phosphorus that's lost. So this is pounds of P2O5 per acre. So this is actual loss. And every year except for 2019, where there was no effect, but every other year, we had an increase in the loss of dissolved reactive phosphorus. Actually, every single year we saw an increase in the concentration of dissolved reactive phosphorus. It's just that 2019, we had a big enough decrease in runoff volume that there was no effect on the amount of phosphorus. Higher concentration, but less volume. And so then the question is why, right? There's been several studies that have also observed this in different areas of the country and world. Many studies have been done in colder climates and the snowmelt runoff, and they found the higher dissolved reactive phosphorus losses because during that snowmelt period where there's tissue that's frozen in the snow from the cover crop, and so well, that increases losses, and that can definitely get lost from that as well. We don't have that happening here. We do have the cover crop out there, but not really frozen tissue, dead tissue on the soil surface, like you would expect in some of these other scenarios. We did look at the possibility for loss. The cover crop tissue could definitely be added to some of the loss. The cover crop tissue is putting about 30% more phosphorus in crop residue or plant residue. Crop and cover crop residue combined, about 30% more phosphorus on the soil surface in the cover crop system, average over all the years. So there's definitely something that's there. There's probably other things, and this probably has to do with that pattern of runoff, I think, where we have more contact time with the soil surface. We also have less sediment loss, and maybe we're eroding a different fraction of that soil that has higher phosphorus concentration in that soil that gets eroded in finer soil particles. We've just got a few other students still looking at this. We've got students looking at maybe changes in soil phosphorus. So we see more organic phosphorus, and maybe that is being lost differently. So a variety of reasons this might be happening. And it's probably a combination of that variety of reasons, not just one. Now, so we're increasing the loss with our cover, or increasing dissolved reactive phosphorus loss with our cover crop. One way to try and counter that is by combining that with other best management practices, and that's what we really suggest to do. In any case, with or without a cover crop, we saw that subsurface placement of the phosphorus fertilizer, that would be the spring injected, or the blue bars, that tended to reduce dissolved reactive phosphorus loss. Some years only a small amount, but up to 50% reduction in dissolved reactive phosphorus, depending upon the year. In dry years, 2018 was a very dry year, and we just didn't have any runoff between like October and August that year. So not a whole lot of effect of timing the phosphorus application. But other years we saw a good decrease, and so we'd recommend, again, subsurface application. Now, after the first 5 years, we, I'd mentioned before, we changed up our phosphorus treatments a little bit. We said, well, what if we managed at a lower soil test in our field? We use a different type of phosphorus fertilizer management. And so we looked at changing. We took the fall broadcast treatment, and that was a build and maintain at a decent rate of phosphorus, and we changed that to a sufficiency treatment. And well, now we're going to draw down our soil phosphorus down to the critical soil test value, and then applying basically the bare minimum amount of phosphorus to maintain our yields, and compare that to a more typical, at least for a lot of producers around here, a more typical build and maintain approach, where we build up our soil test above where it would be responsive, and then we maintain it at that high level with phosphorus application. It's about the same as crop removal. So let me show you a little bit of data now on that, the effects of this treatment. And here we still see the same thing, where our cover crop is increasing this is total phosphorus concentration in the runoff. The cover crop is shown with the hashed lines, the phosphorus fertilizer treatments with the colors, where the sufficiency is the orange, the build and maintain is the blue, and the control is the gray. And we see that for that first year of the study, though, or of that change, the new treatments, we only saw the increase, the cover crop increase dissolved reactive phosphorus in that build and maintain treatment. The second year, similar. The phosphorus concentration in the runoff increased for the build and maintain, not for the other treatments. The third year, we saw it now increase a little bit for the sufficiency, but the increase was greater. The cover crop had a greater increase with the build and maintain. Similar results were seen with dissolved reactive phosphorus losses from the field, where that build and maintain treatment tended to have the cover crop tended to have a larger impact on dissolved reactive phosphorus when you're in a build and maintain. So if we're adding phosphorus fertilizer and we're above the critical soil test value, basically putting plenty of phosphorus out there for our crop, well, the cover crop, either through increasing soil contact with the runoff or taking up additional phosphorus and siphoning it to the surface, whatever the mechanism, that cover crop's having a bigger impact. So, summary of what we're recommending here. Cover crops are excellent at reducing runoff intensity, excellent at reducing sediment loss. Want to encourage cover crop use from that standpoint, particularly when we have erosion concerns and runoff concerns. It only decreased total phosphorus loss when erosion was fairly high. When we had low erosion, there was no effect on total phosphorus loss. And so in soils where erosion might not be that great, because maybe we're using no-till or other conservation practices, we might want to look at combining, or we should look at combining the cover crop with other best management practices for phosphorus fertilizer. Particularly subsurface placement of phosphorus fertilizer and controlling that soil test value. Not applying phosphorus fertilizer if we're above the critical soil test for phosphorus. That would be our best recommendation for controlling dissolved reactive phosphorus losses with our cover crop system. Forward here. Before we jump into questions and stuff, I just want to thank our funding agencies and partners. Had a lot of people contribute to this. For our research fund, the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, Natural Resource Conservation Service, the Kansas Soybean Commission, Kansas Department of Agriculture, and we appreciate all their support. So with that,
I can jump in, Nathan. And okay, so first off, if you need a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker, and her email is alenaw@iastate.edu. Again, alenaw@iastate.edu. And email her your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. Okay. Next, if you watch this webinar live and are willing to fill out a demographic survey, that would be great. Only one survey response is needed for all 2023 webinars. So if you watch one in 2023 and submitted a survey, thank you very much. But if this is your first webinar and you haven't filled that out, if you would be willing to do that, iowalearningfarms.org/survey, or you can scan the QR code and then just put in a plug for the webinar for next week. Should be the next slide.
Yeah, and we'll see if this works. I think I mixed up a few slides.
That's okay.
Here's the information you had for CEU credits, right?
Yep. So alenaw@iastate.edu.
Yeah. And for next week.
Okay, we're gonna talk about Julia's gonna talk about using data to understand the connections in the Iowa food, energy, water nexus. So definitely tune in again next week. We have had some questions that have come in, Nathan. The first one, were there any effects on, so this outside of what you talked about, but somebody had a question if there were any effects to yield in the 0P plots, or the ones with the higher P
Sure.
application rates?
Yeah, there was, yeah. And let's see. Oh, it's the best. Yield did decrease, and I had a slide for that somewhere. Oh, here it is. Oops. that didn't. Let's see if I can. Just without having to. Here, you want to flip through a bunch of slides. Oh, about right there. There we go. Grain yield. Okay. So yeah, there were effects of both the cover crop and the phosphorus management. The phosphorus management effects tended to be a little bit more in corn. You can see that in 2017 and 2019, we saw a decrease in corn yield with the cover crop, or not the cover crop, with the control, the phosphorus control. Since then, I don't have that data on here. We've seen a more consistent decline in yield for both soybean and corn. And so our, as we continue to draw down the phosphorus, I think we're somewhere around like 4 parts per million, maybe 3 phosphorus in that control number. And so it's pretty low.
Yeah. There's a question, how much biomass on average was produced by the cover crops, and were there any effects of the phosphorus treatment on cover crop biomass?
Yes, there was an effect of phosphorus treatment on cover crop biomass, and that actually, I was just looking at data this year, and I think I'd have to go back and look and see if it affected last year. It actually affected sediment loss this year, where we saw a little bit more sediment loss in the control cover crop than the cover crops without the control, or the cover crops that receive fertilizer. So in the treatments, the cover crop treatments that received phosphorus fertilizer, the receiving phosphorus fertilizer have greater biomass and less erosion than the cover crop treatment that didn't get phosphorus fertilizer. So the phosphorus fertilizer was holding back cover crop yield a little bit, more now than it was the beginning of the study. And the amount of yield, the amount of biomass that we get, I think our largest biomass might be close to 3,000 pounds per acre. And then some of the smallest years might have been like 200 pounds.
Okay, great.
And you know, it depends upon if we're planting, you know, after corn and before soybean, we get more. We have more growing degree days in the fall and more growing degree days in the spring, and we get much larger cover crops. So before soybean, we tend to have the larger cover crops. In 2017, we had a pretty large cover crop right before corn, and that had to do with some of the, you know, just the weather that year. The cover crop grew much better than the other years before.
All right. There are a couple questions here. Did you do any work with measuring infiltration at the site, and you know, how might research sites, do they have limitations relative to infiltration that might be impacting the results?
Sure, yeah. So we have not done an actual like infiltrometer type measurement of infiltration. Okay? They're big plots, and those infiltration measurements tend to be highly variable across landscape, and can be difficult to actually get good data on. We get infiltration, basically net infiltration, every single time it runs off, because then we know how much rain came down on the plot, and we know how much left the plot, and so the difference is infiltration, right? And so we get an idea of infiltration that way. We have measured aggregate stability, and there tends to be, in smaller plot studies and so forth, there tends to be a good correlation between aggregate stability and infiltration. Increasing in aggregate stability are correlated with increases in infiltration. And we have seen that the cover crop increases aggregate stability and has increased aggregate stability quite considerably during the study. So we see better aggregate stability, what aggregate stability. How might this change? I guess, as far as cover crop effects on runoff, I think that definitely the soils that you're in, the climate, and are going to affect how the cover crop might affect runoff. These soils are heavier clay soils. I think silty clay loam, silty clay loam, surface, and then more heavier silty clay substrates. I think we're somewhere between 23 and 25% clay in the surface, and then more like 35 to 36 or 38% clay in the substrates. And, just like 12 inches long. So, so that makes for a site, and this is pretty typical for a lot of this area in Kansas, and probably some areas there in Iowa as well, where you have considerable runoff because it doesn't infiltrate as fast. The rainfall is faster than infiltration is. It's also harder for the cover crop to get down and really change the percolation, the deep percolation, when you have a pretty heavy clay soil and a VT horizon that goes down from 1 foot deep down to 4 feet deep or something like that. Pretty thick VT horizon. Maybe not, but it goes down to 3 or 4 feet. Anyway, so yeah, so if you're in a different soil, the cover crop might have different effects on runoff.
Okay. Next one is related to kind of what you might recommend in a manure management system, especially solid manure, of incorporating cover crops and tillage. Any recommendations based on this work or other work you've done?
Yeah. So I didn't present any data from the very first year of this study because this field had been in conventional till. And then the first year of the study, when we set everything up, the whole site was tilled, and then we planted our cover crop. And so that first year was really like a look at how cover crop affects losses in conventional tillage. And then when we were able to move more into a no-till. So, and if you look at, in that year, the cover crop had huge effects on runoff, well, it had effects on runoff, had effects on sediment loss, decreased phosphorus loss, everything, because there was so much sediment loss. And so you have to recognize when you're tilling a soil, I think that I would highly encourage cover crop use if you have to till the soil, because it's going to do a really good job of reducing erosion. And so then when you're in a manured system, often if you're cattle manure or something like that, that you have to put on the surface, you can't inject. From a phosphorus management standpoint and a nutrient conservation standpoint, we would encourage you to till that or incorporate that manure. And so as soon as you incorporate the manure, planting a cover crop after it would be a great way to now protect the soil that you just tilled. So I would encourage that practice. I would highly encourage cover crops to be used after manure incorporation.
Can you explain the slides at the end again, showing the fertilizer management effects on concentration? The person was confused by the language of 19% decrease in total P for sufficiency management without cover crop, 45% decrease in total P for sufficiency management without cover crop. They wondered if one should be a increase. I think that one, yeah.
Okay. Let me see. So this is basically saying that the sufficiency management, when you didn't use a cover crop, the sufficiency management decreased total P loss by 19%.
Okay.
When we used a cover crop, the sufficiency P management decreased total P by 45%. So
Okay.
basically you get a greater, because the cover crop tended to increase dissolved reactive phosphorus losses and total phosphorus concentration more, right? The cover in a build and maintain system, it increased that more. The effects of going from build and maintain to sufficiency resulted in a greater reduction. So basically what we're looking at is if I'm comparing, and this is an average across all these, but if I'm comparing the difference between the blue bar and the orange bar in each one of these, the dark blue bar, orange bar, on average, the orange was a 19% decrease compared to the blue. If I compare the hash bars, the blue and the orange, then on average, the orange bar was 45% less than the hash blue bar. So that's how that was calculated.
Okay, great. Guess maybe the last one in the interest of time. Can you talk, guess this person might have missed it, but for the first part of the study, what you used for the cover crop mixtures?
Sure. For the first part of the study, we used a small grain and brassica mostly. A small grain was sometimes wheat, sometimes triticale, kind of depended upon the year and the crop that we were following with. And then the brassica was rapeseed. Some years, even when we got an excellent rapeseed stand in the fall and had this beautiful looking mix of rapeseed and triticale, the next spring it was all triticale. Didn't really have much of the brassica that overwintered and came back up. So in essence, most of the cover, 99% of the cover crop biomass was small grain.
Yeah, that's consistent with what we saw in the mixture study too. So, all right, Nathan, thank you so much for this really informative presentation. Really appreciate your time today. Again, if you need a CCA CEU, email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu with your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. And please do that by 5 o'clock today. With that, thanks a lot. And Nathan, I'll give you the last word.
Oh, well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to come and talk to you. Happy to answer any questions. If I wasn't able to get to your question there on the chat, you can send me an email at nonelson@ksu.edu.
All right. All right. Thanks so much, Nathan.
Thanks.